one child, two mothers. Jimmy Kimmel's daring question about Baron Trump turned polite conversation into a high-stakes confrontation. The women's reactions left everyone speechless, and the night unforgettable. The night began like any other. For Jimmy Kimmel, he arrived at the studio with his usual calm confidence, exchanging greetings with the crew and checking his notes one last time. From the outside, it looked like any ordinary evening. Bright lights, a cheering audience, and the hum of anticipation that always filled the room before a show went live. Jimmy had done this countless times before. But there was something different in the air tonight. The audience chatted quietly among themselves, taking their seats, sipping their drinks, and laughing softly at the opening music. Cameras moved silently, capturing every detail as the show prepared to go live. Jimmy sat behind his desk, a small smile playing across his face, ready to greet viewers and begin the night segment with his signature mix of humor and charm. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until the doors at the side of the stage opened and two women walked in who could instantly change the tone of the evening. Melania Trump entered first. She moved with an elegance that demanded attention without asking for it. Her steps were measured, her posture flawless, and her smile polite but reserved. There was a quiet confidence about her that made the room pause, even if only subconsciously. The audience, though trying to maintain a steady cheer, could not help but feel a ripple of curiosity run through them. People whispered, leaned slightly forward in their seats, and stole glances at the other side of the room. It wasn't often that someone like Melania Trump appeared on a talk show, and the energy shifted immediately. A moment later, Ivanka Trump followed. The contrast between the two women was striking but complementary. While Melania exuded a serene calm, Ivanka carried a spark of energy and confidence. Her smile was broader, her gestures more animated, and she seemed more inclined to engage directly with the audience. The room reacted almost instinctively, sensing that this was a different kind of night. Ivanka waved, her presence radiating, a mix of charisma and authority. The audience's polite applause grew louder, and for a brief moment, it felt like the studio had shifted from a typical talk show setting to something more charged, almost electric. Jimmy's initial reaction was a mix of curiosity and caution. He greeted them warmly, offering the usual pleasantries that any host would extend to such guests. "It's great to have you both here tonight," he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of excitement. "Welcome to the show." Melania nodded slightly, maintaining her composed smile, while Ivanka leaned slightly forward, giving a small wave to acknowledge the audience's attention. The atmosphere was polite, professional, yet brimming with anticipation. Everyone in the room seemed to sense that this was no ordinary interview. The first few minutes went by smoothly. They exchanged light conversation, remarks about travel, events, and public appearances. Jimmy made a few jokes, aiming to ease the tension, and the women responded with polite laughter. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a silent current of intensity. Every gesture, every word carried more weight than usual. The audience felt it, Jimmy felt it, even in his experience with high-profile guests. He knew when a night had the potential to take an unexpected turn, and tonight felt exactly like that. What made the moment even more fascinating was the subtle way both women commanded attention. Melania didn't need to speak to make an impression. The calm authority in her eyes, the way she carried herself, spoke volumes. Ivanka, on the other hand, filled the space with her energy, her tone firm, yet approachable, her expressions easy to read. Together, they created a balance of poise and assertiveness, leaving Jimmy in a position where he had to be both careful and clever in how he navigated the conversation. Even the audience, normally quick to laugh at every joke, remained attentive. Whispers and glances exchanged across rows as people tried to read the dynamic between the host and the guests. It was as though everyone sensed the underlying tension even before it was spoken aloud. There was a story here, unspoken but tangible, that had begun to unfold in the room. Jimmy continued the conversation, asking simple questions about everyday topics, hoping to keep the mood light. Yet, there was an unspoken understanding that something bigger was coming. The audience, absorbed in every detail, leaned in to catch every glance, every subtle expression. Each smile, each pause, each carefully measured word seemed to carry more meaning than it would in a typical interview. And then, just when the initial pleasantries were coming to a natural close, a question hovered in the air, a question that would change the tone of the entire evening. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it carried the weight of curiosity, of tension, of something just beyond the boundary of polite conversation. And in that instant, everyone in the room knew. This night, which began like any other, was about to become unforgettable. The ordinary had shifted into the extraordinary. What started as a standard evening of talk show humor and small talk now held the promise of confrontation, revelation, and attention so sharp it could almost be felt in the audience's collective breath. The night was set, the stage prepared, not just with lights and cameras, but with the kind of anticipation that only comes when powerful personalities meet in a space where anything could happen. After the initial greetings and polite conversation, the atmosphere in the studio felt controlled, almost serene. The audience had settled into the rhythm of a typical talk show. Light, laughter, friendly chatter, and an expectation of humor. Jimmy Kimmel, ever the professional, kept the discussion flowing with small talk and casual questions, touching on topics like recent events, travel, and family life. Everything appeared normal. Yet, beneath the surface, the tension was beginning to form, quiet but unmistakable. Jimmy had built his reputation not just as a comedian, but as someone willing to ask questions that others might avoid. Tonight, he seemed to sense an opening. With a careful, deliberate tone, he shifted the conversation towards something more sensitive. It wasn't meant to be cruel, but it was bold, and it immediately changed the energy in the room. He mentioned a claim made by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a claim that had stirred whispers across political and social circles. According to her, there was speculation that Baron Trump might not actually be Melania's son, and that shockingly, some believe Ivanka might be his real mother. The words hung in the air like a sudden sharp gust of wind. The audience reacted. First, a soft gasp moving through the seats, subtle but audible. Some leaned forward, unsure if they had heard correctly. Jimmy, aware of the weight of what he had just said, leaned slightly toward his guests, his tone measured but serious. "How do you both respond to that?" he asked, his eyes flicking between them. For a moment, silence filled the space. Melania's face remained calm, but her smile tightened just slightly. There was a restraint in her expression, a quiet firmness that suggested she had heard questions like this before and had learned how to respond. Ivanka, sitting beside her, shifted slightly, her posture steady and deliberate. She answered in a calm, controlled voice, saying, "We are not going to comment on this, Jimmy." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The audience sensed the tension immediately. The calm exterior of the room now felt fragile, like glass teetering, on the edge of shattering. Jimmy, for all his experience, bent back down. He leaned forward, his voice calm, but persistent. "People are talking about it everywhere," he said. "There are even DNA reports being mentioned. Your silence is making people wonder even more." With that, the air seemed to thicken. The audience, once relaxed and entertained, now held its breath. Every eye in the room was fixed on the three of them, trying to read the unspoken signals between Jimmy and his guests. Melania and Ivanka had carefully maintained their composure, but the question had clearly struck a chord. Jimmy's persistence had shifted the conversation from lighthearted small talk into territory that was serious. Almost volatile, Melania's response came slowly but firmly. She leaned slightly toward the microphone, her voice calm yet carrying an unmistakable edge. "I think the last time my husband came here, he already warned you about asking cheap questions. Did you forget?" The words were carefully measured, yet heavy with implication. There was no shouting, no dramatics, just a firm, cold statement that reminded everyone of the boundaries Jimmy had just crossed. The audience reacted subtly but unmistakably. Whispers ran through the crowd, some nervous laughter trickling out, but it was clear that the room had shifted. What had started as a playful conversation now had the tension of something far more serious. Ivanka's response was sharper, more immediate. Her eyes locked on Jimmy, and her voice carried authority and warning. "Jimmy, you can't just say anything. You want on live TV. I can send you to jail for even asking this." The statement landed like a hammer blow. The audience reacted instinctively, a ripple of shock running through the seats. Jimmy's expression shifted in a way that showed he recognized the seriousness of the situation, even if he had initially underestimated it. For the first time that evening, he paused, and the energy of the room shifted from tense curiosity to outright suspense. It became clear that what had begun as a casual talk show segment had now transformed into a confrontation, not of anger, but of power and control. The audience watched, captivated and silent, sensing that this was a rare moment where politeness, humor, and authority collided. Melania's calm firmness and Ivanka's directness made it clear that boundaries were being established and that these were not to be crossed. Jimmy, despite his usual confidence and quick wit, now had to navigate carefully. This was more than just a question about rumors. It was a test of poise, restraint, and influence. Every word, every reaction carried significance. The silence that followed Ivanka's statement wasn't empty. It was loaded with meaning. The audience understood that the conversation had crossed an invisible line, one that neither guest would allow to be breached lightly. Even as Jimmy tried to recover, his voice measured and slightly tense. The tension in the room remained palpable. He had asked the question, he had pressed the issue, and now he was faced with a calm but unmistakable boundary. The audience, caught between curiosity and disbelief, watched every subtle movement, every controlled reaction, and every carefully chosen word. By the time this segment reached this point, it was clear that the night was no longer about small talk, humor, or casual entertainment. What had started as an ordinary talk show moment had become an extraordinary glimpse into power, composure, and the weight of unspoken authority. The controversial question had set the stage for what was about to unfold, a series of events that no one in the studio or watching from home would soon forget. The room was heavy with tension. Jimmy Kimmel, who had spent years mastering the art of navigating tricky interviews, suddenly found himself in uncharted territory. The question he had posed, innocent in his mind, provocative to some, had shifted the conversation into a space that was both serious and uncomfortable. The audience, previously relaxed and ready for laughs, now sat silent, sensing that what was about to happen could not be predicted. Melania Trump leaned slightly closer to the microphone, her calm demeanor masking the power in her words. When she spoke, her voice was low and measured, yet every word carried an unmistakable firmness. "I think the last time my husband came here, he already warned you about asking cheap questions. Did you forget?" The sentence was simple, yet it struck like a blow. There was no need for drama or shouting. The calmness of her tone made it even more chilling. It was a reminder that she was not just a guest, but someone accustomed to navigating scrutiny, someone who knew the weight of authority and how to assert it without raising her voice. The subtle warning in her words made the entire room feel the gravity of the moment. Jimmy tried to recover. He laughed softly, an awkward, shaky laugh that did little to mask his surprise. For years, he had hosted celebrities, politicians, and controversial figures alike. But this was different. There was a quiet intensity about Melania's presence, a strength that required careful handling. Jimmy's usual confidence faltered for just a moment, enough for the audience to notice. The dynamic in the room had shifted, and everyone was acutely aware of it. Then Ivanka Trump spoke, her tone sharper, more immediate. There was no hesitation in her voice, no attempt to soften the message. "Jimmy, you can't just say anything you want on live TV. I can send you to jail for even asking this." The words landed like a thunderclap. The audience reacted instinctively, a collective gasp rippling through the studio. The statement was serious, direct, and unexpected. Jimmy, who had been pressing forward with confidence, now realized the situation had escalated far beyond a routine interview. The conversation had moved into a realm of authority, law, and personal boundaries that he could not easily navigate. With humor or charm, Ivanka's posture and expression reinforced her words. Her calmness, mixed with determination, suggested that she was entirely in control. She did not need to shout or gesticulate. The weight of her statement was carried entirely by the clarity and certainty in her tone. The audience understood that she was establishing a line that Jimmy could not cross. For the first time that evening, the talk show host, usually quick with a joke or comeback, was being forced to pause and consider the consequences of his words. Melania, ever composed, added an unspoken layer of reinforcement to Ivanka's statement. Her silence, her calm gaze, and her measured presence spoke volumes. Together they presented a united front, one of calm authority and unwavering confidence. It was clear that this was not a moment for theatrics. It was a moment for recognition of boundaries, for respect of power, and for understanding that some questions were not meant to be answered. Jimmy's reaction was complex. On one hand, he was a professional, a seasoned host who had faced difficult situations countless times. On the other, the nature of this confrontation was unlike anything he had encountered before. It was not a matter of personality clashes or light disagreement. It was a direct challenge, a warning that carried real implications. The room seemed to shrink around him, the usual safety net of humor and audience support replaced by a palpable seriousness. The audience, sensing the high stakes, became even more attentive. There was no laughter, no side conversations, only an acute awareness of the tension. Every shift in posture, every glance, every slight movement seemed amplified. The energy in the studio was now a tangible force, one that demanded respect and careful consideration. The warning was not just about the question itself. It was about control, about authority, and about understanding the limits of power in a public space. Jimmy, despite his experience, realized that he had ventured into a space where humor and bravado were insufficient. The subtle but firm boundary established by Melania, reinforced by Ivanka's explicit warning, created a clear message. Some topics are off limits, and crossing that line comes with consequences. Even as Jimmy processed this, the weight of the moment continued to build. The quiet authority of the two women, their composure in the face of direct provocation, and the audience's heightened awareness combined to create an atmosphere of suspense. Every word spoken from that point forward would be scrutinized, every gesture interpreted, and every reaction measured against the unspoken rules they had just established. The shift in power was unmistakable. The evening had begun with a sense of casual entertainment, but now it had transformed into a moment of caution and tension. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his ability to navigate complex conversations with humor, faced a reality that he could not rely on his usual strategies. The warning had been issued clearly and effectively, and had left a lasting impression on everyone present. In that moment, it became evident that the night would not proceed as any ordinary talk show. The warning had changed the rules. The audience, the host, and even the women themselves understood that this was a turning point, a demonstration of calm authority, meeting curiosity, and a lesson in the power of boundaries, silence, and carefully chosen words. The stage had been set for what would become an unforgettable confrontation, and the tension that now filled the room promised that nothing from this point forward would be ordinary. The tension in the room had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Jimmy Kimmel, usually quick with a joke or a clever retort, found himself navigating a situation that was far beyond his usual control. The question he had asked, combined with the firm warnings from Melania and Ivanka, had created an atmosphere that was electric with suspense. Every person in the audience, every crew member, and every camera operator could feel it. The air was thick with anticipation, like the calm just before a storm breaks. Jimmy, attempting to regain some semblance of control, slammed his cards onto the desk. The gesture was sharp, almost involuntary, as if the action alone could assert authority back into his hands. One child, two mothers. The nation wants an answer, he said, his voice rising with urgency. The words echoed through the studio, breaking the fragile quiet that had settled over the room. The audience, stunned into silence by the sheer intensity of the moment, leaned forward, captivated and unsure of what would happen next. The usual laughter, the side conversations, the easygoing energy of a talk show, everything had vanished. Jimmy's voice, firm and insistent, had turned the conversation from tension into full-blown confrontation. He didn't stop there. With a sharp tone, he pressed further. The nation also wants to know about the connection between Ivanka and Trump that keeps coming up. Are you hiding something? Ivanka's reaction was immediate. Her face, which had been controlled and firm, momentarily palled, but then it hardened. A mask of authority, replacing any hint of surprise. She was not someone to be rattled easily, and the audience could see that. Without another word, she rose from her seat, moving with a deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly what she intended to do. There was no hesitation, no question of tone. Her actions carried the weight of decisiveness. She pulled out her phone and spoke with a clarity that left no room for argument. I will call and issue an arrest warrant. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The audience, who had been holding their breath, reacted instantly with shock and disbelief. The weight of her statement was unlike anything the viewers had expected. It was not a joke. It was not a quip. It was a declaration of action, one that made it clear this confrontation had crossed from verbal sparring into a serious real-world implication. Melania, ever composed, followed quietly. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the gravity of the situation. She did not speak, but her presence amplified the seriousness of Ivanka's declaration. There was a silent understanding between the two women, a wordless coordination that communicated authority and unity. The audience could sense that they were witnessing not just a confrontation, but a display of control and power at a level rarely seen in public. Jimmy, for the first time that evening, looked genuinely unsettled. His confidence, which had carried him through countless difficult interviews and unpredictable guests, now wavered. He had been bold, persistent, and even aggressive with his questions, but the response he received was beyond anything he had anticipated. The challenge he had posed, meant to draw answers and provoke a reaction, had turned back on him, and the consequences were clear. The room was silent, yet the silence was heavy with meaning. Every audience member, normally so comfortable with comedy and light banter, sat frozen, understanding that what they were witnessing was more than just entertainment. It was a rare glimpse into the boundaries of privacy, authority, and personal power. The confrontation was not simply about answering questions. It was about asserting control, about making a statement that some line should never be crossed. Even as Ivanka and Melania exited the stage, the impact of their actions lingered. The weight of the moment did not dissipate immediately. The audience, Jimmy, and even the crew felt the intensity of the confrontation in the seconds that followed. It was clear that the exchange would be remembered not for the usual humor or banter of a talk show, but for the force and decisiveness with which boundaries had been enforced. The confrontation also revealed something deeper about human dynamics and authority. It showed that even in a situation where one person holds traditional power, such as a host controlling the direction of a show, the presence of calm, confidence, and firm boundaries could completely shift the balance. Melania's composed silence, paired with Ivanka's assertive declaration, demonstrated a type of power that does not need to shout or command attention. It simply exists and asserts itself naturally. For Jimmy, the moment was a lesson in restraint and awareness. The questions he had asked, while intended to provoke, had collided with forces that could not be swayed by humor, charm, or cleverness. The confrontation reminded everyone in the room that authority and influence come in many forms, and that, sometimes, the most powerful response is not an answer but a boundary that cannot be crossed. As the audience slowly began to absorb what had happened, the full weight of the confrontation settled in. It was a night that would be remembered not for who spoke the most or who was the funniest, but for the undeniable demonstration of control and influence. The events of that evening proved that even in a setting built for entertainment, real-life consequences and personal power could emerge in ways that no one expected. By the time the stage emptied and the cameras stopped rolling, the audience had witnessed a confrontation that went beyond words. It had been a clash of curiosity and authority, persistence and restraint, audacity and control. The evening had transformed into an unforgettable lesson on power, boundaries, and the undeniable impact of presence and decisiveness. The studio was silent after the confrontation, a silence heavy with disbelief and tension. The audience, usually buzzing with laughter and applause, sat frozen, processing what they had just witnessed. The energy of the night had shifted completely. What had begun as a seemingly ordinary talk show had transformed into a dramatic encounter that no one could forget. Jimmy Kimmel, usually quick with jokes and witty remarks, sat back trying to regain composure. The usual rhythm of a late-night show, laughter, applause, light conversation, had been replaced by something far more serious. The reality of what had just unfolded was not lost on him, and it quickly became clear that this episode would linger in everyone's memory for a long time. For the audience, there was a mix of shock, fascination, and a reluctant admiration. Melania's calm composure and Ivanka's firm decisiveness had created a moment that transcended the usual boundaries of entertainment. It was no longer about humor or celebrity chatter. It was about power, control, and personal boundaries. The viewers had witnessed a rare lesson in authority and the ways in which it could be asserted without raising one's voice. Melania and Ivanka had demonstrated that sometimes strength comes not from confrontation itself, but from the quiet confidence to assert one's position clearly and decisively. Melania's measured.com had conveyed an unspoken warning, while Ivanka's assertive declaration had shown that some matters are not up for debate. The audience, absorbing every detail, understood that the encounter had been about more than just a question. It had been a test of boundaries and influence, and the two women had navigated it with unmatched poise. Jimmy, meanwhile, had been placed in a unique position. For years, he had relied on humor, charm, and quick thinking to navigate complex situations and unpredictable guests. Tonight, those skills had met a challenge they could not fully neutralize. The confrontation revealed that some situations demand more than wit. They require recognition of authority, restraint, and the understanding that certain lines are not to be crossed. The night had provided him with a lesson in humility and awareness, and even the audience could feel the weight of it. The aftermath extended beyond the immediate confrontation. Conversations among the audience members shifted from laughter to analysis, speculation, and reflection. People whispered to one another, dissecting the power dynamic that had unfolded before them. There was a recognition that the moment had offered more than entertainment. It had provided insight into human behavior, influence, and the consequences of pushing boundaries too far. It was also a lesson in timing and restraint. Melanians.com/measured approach contrasted with Ivanka's decisive action, but together they had demonstrated a clear message. Strength can be both subtle and unmistakable. They had turned a moment that could have been chaotic into a controlled display of authority, proving that confidence and composure often speak louder than words. For anyone watching, it was a reminder that actions and demeanor often carry more weight than verbal responses alone. Even after the cameras stopped rolling, the impact of the confrontation lingered. Studio staff, crew members, and audience members alike carry the energy of the night with them, replaying moments, analyzing expressions, and discussing the unspoken tension that had dominated the room. The episode would be remembered not for jokes or celebrity chatter, but for the undeniable demonstration of personal power and the consequences of overstepping boundaries. For Jimmy, the experience would likely become a story to reflect upon for years to come. It was a reminder that even in settings built for entertainment, real-life authority and personal boundaries cannot be ignored. The confrontation had challenged him in ways that no scripted joke or prepared question could anticipate, highlighting the complexity of human interaction and the necessity of respect, particularly when dealing with powerful figures. The audience, in turn, had witnessed a rare glimpse into the intersection of public perception and private authority. They had seen how a single question could escalate into a situation that demanded composure, strategy, and courage. The evening had transformed a standard talk show into a moment of education, observation, and reflection, offering insights into negotiation, influence, and the subtle dynamics of power. By the end of the night, one thing was clear. The episode would not be measured in laughs or applause, but in the resonance of the encounter itself. The confrontation had left an indelible mark, demonstrating that even in spaces designed for entertainment, there are moments where seriousness, authority, and restraint take center stage. It was a night that challenged expectations, reshaped dynamics, and left a lasting impression on everyone involved. As the audience left the studio and the crew began to dismantle the set, the energy of the confrontation remained. People would talk about the evening for weeks, not just because of who was present, but because of what had occurred. A powerful lesson in authority, boundaries, and the impact of words and actions when combined with composure and confidence. The night had begun like any other, but it had ended as something unforgettable. It had shown that moments of tension, if met with calm and decisiveness, could teach lessons far beyond the scope of entertainment. It had reminded everyone that power, respect, and personal boundaries are forces that can shape an encounter in ways no one anticipates. In the quiet that followed, the lesson lingered. Some questions are better left unasked. Some lines are not meant to be crossed.